Joining us now is Donald Trump's niece, Mary Trump. She's the author of a book about her uncle called Too Much and Never Enough, How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. She's also the host of The Nerd Avengers on MaryTrumpMedia.com. And I should tell you, this is Mary's first interview since this verdict today. Mary Trump, it's nice to see you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. We appreciate having you here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Rachel.
What was your reaction when you first heard the news?
I was, as you can imagine, relieved, happy, and it took a minute to sink in. But it also, as the counts went 1 through 34, guilty, 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 et cetera, the weight of this moment really sunk in. It really hit me. This has so much meaning for all of us. I'm incredibly proud of my city and my state. I am really just relieved on behalf of the American people. This is such a long time coming. And I know that he's been found guilty of the charges that were presented to the jury, but in some ways it feels like it's standing in for all of the other crimes this man has gotten away with his entire life. So there was something just incredibly gratifying and moving about it. And I've heard people say that we can celebrate the jury system, we can celebrate the jurors and the way this trial was handled, but it's a dark day in America that somebody in Donald's position has been found guilty of these crimes. And I would respectfully disagree. I think it's a great day for America. I think it shows us that in some instances, when it really matters, the system is holding, and that even somebody like him, who has with impunity gotten away with some of the most egregious crimes over the course of decades, has finally, at long last, been held accountable.
What impact do you think this will have on him personally? You understand his sort of demeanor and his history in a way that the rest of us don't. The rest of us have only ever seen the public side of him. How do you think this will change him or land with him? How do you think he'll respond?
You know, it's interesting. I heard Michael Cohen say earlier that Donald is somebody who will never take responsibility and will always deflect and cast blame to anybody else. And, you know, this is something he learned at the knees of my grandfather, who taught Donald the same thing. You just never take responsibility for anything. We saw that during his disastrous 4 years during his administration. He never takes responsibility for anything. And because of that, along with the fact that, again, he has operated with impunity for so long, I think it's going to take a while for this to sink in. And I think we're going to see a very similar dynamic to what happened after the 2020 election. There was a moment in private when he understood that he had lost. He will understand that he has indeed been found guilty on 34 criminal counts. I'm sorry, I shouldn't smile, but it makes me smile to say that out loud. But the humiliation of that is going to hit him so deeply, as it did 4 years ago, that he, as I believe you said earlier, will have to create his alternate reality. And unfortunately, we see that this is not something that just impacts him. This is something that has drawn in millions, tens of millions of people, and it has left all of us at risk. So I think we need to expect the same thing here. He will do everything in his power to spin this so that it is, well, he'll try to make it an advantage to him. And we need to guard against that. And he will also stop at nothing to change the subject. So I do not agree that we don't have to worry about violence here. We need to worry about his willingness and eagerness, actually, to use his power and his platform to get other people to carry out his threats. We saw this yesterday when Officer Fanone's mother was swatted shortly after he showed up to speak his mind outside of the courthouse yesterday. So there's a lot going on, but we can never, ever underestimate or overestimate, the extent to which Donald will use any means at his disposal to deflect and get his way.
Mary, it's Alex Wagner. Thanks for joining us tonight. We know from reports and from witnessing ourselves that your uncle was resting his retinas, to be generous, for at many points during this trial. When the verdict was read, however, he was very much eyes wide open. He was paying attention and he was largely expressionless. Maybe that's because there weren't cameras in the courtroom, or maybe just because he was intently focused. Do you think he is afraid right now? There is the very real possibility that he will serve prison time. It may not be this year. We don't know when it will be. But given what Michael Cohen served for the same crime, I do wonder if you think he quietly is very scared.
Well, he certainly should be. And whether he expresses that consciously or not, I don't know. But certainly on a deep level, he is afraid because, Alex, this is a moment he has been dreading his entire life. Donald has always known that he is nothing of what he's claimed to be. He is not a tough guy. He is not an outlaw. He is somebody who is terrified of humiliation. He's somebody who understands that in the language of my family, being a loser is absolutely the worst thing you can be. He cannot pretend otherwise. And I think he also must sense that this is a very big domino that's fallen here. And we may see, or hopefully we will see, a very swift unraveling of his support. I think we're going to see a lot of trial balloons in the next few days from Republicans who may not want to be associated with somebody who is a convicted felon running for the presidency. But there are all sorts of reasons for Donald to be afraid right now. And I think chief among them, even though this is not something that can happen in reality, he understands that in my family, if you're a loser, that's something that's going to get you killed. Metaphorically speaking, of course.
Mary, it's Lawrence O'Donnell, and I wanted to follow up on that loser point because I watched your uncle in the courtroom for so many days, and with Michael Cohen on the stand and others, and your uncle was sitting there as a salesman that he always is. He's always been trying to sell something. He was trying to sell those 12 people on a story he wasn't willing to say himself. He wasn't willing to get on the witness stand and testify about. Michael Cohen did testify. And now, when Donald Trump heard that word guilty 34 times, he discovered that it didn't work, that he spent all these weeks in this room trying to sell those people, and it didn't work. They unanimously, they did not buy it. And at the same time, when he heard those 34 guilties, he had to realize they believed Stormy Daniels. They believed everything she said, every one of those details about inside the hotel room. They believed Michael Cohen. They did not believe my side of the story that I was trying to sell them. And so he comes out the loser in that, charm and selling contest with that jury. And I'm just wondering what that does to him, because that goes to the very core of what he thinks his talent is, which is convincing people of things.
Lawrence, it's such an excellent point. We see, and he has learned what happens in a situation in which he is not fully in control, or he doesn't have other people controlling the environment to his benefit. And we saw this, I think, in part by his complete lack of understanding that he even needed to try. I think if you want the jury on your side, you're not going to fall asleep during people's testimony. You're not going to attack them ever in any way whatsoever. You're going to be attentive. You're not going to complain about the conditions inside of the courtroom, because he's not the only person who needed to be there, but he's the only person who was there because he didn't have a choice, because he's the one who committed these crimes, we can now say. Everybody else had to be there also because of what he had done. So he just didn't understand what it means to cater to people in an environment he doesn't control. And I think it was his lack of control that made it impossible for him to rise to the occasion. And of course, we know he was never going to testify. So he really needed to just sort of behave like a respectful, decent human being who is taking this seriously and not just sort of skating on his hope that the jury was going to be so intimidated by him and his power and his position. And it failed miserably. And I think he's going to understand that. He will blame his lawyers. He will blame the judge. He will blame everybody on this TV program right now. You know, he'll blame everybody. He won't take responsibility, but he will understand the limits to his own personal power. And I think that's going to freak him out.
Hey, Mary, it's Joy. Thank you for being here tonight. You know, if he's had a reckoning emotionally, even privately, after this conviction, he will have another on July 11th when he is sentenced. And then 4 days later, he will accept the nomination of the Republican Party. Prepare us for what the propaganda field will look like. How will he explain this and call upon his party to explain this to that crowd at the Republican National Convention? What should we expect to hear as an excuse for what happened, what had just happened at that point 4 days earlier?
Joy, it's a great question, and it's sort of related to what we were just talking about a minute ago. He is going to feel completely unbound now by any sense of having to operate within somebody else's system, to the extent that he even bothered. But once we get to sentencing, I think he's also going to realize that the other thing he wasn't able to control and wasn't able to behave in the context of was the idea that he might be facing prison. And the irony for him, of course, is that if he had behaved like a normal human being throughout this trial, I think that the risk of prison would have been fairly low. But because of his egregious behavior, because he broke that gag order 11 times, because the judge had to make that ruling, and because the judge deferred any significant punishment, I think the chances that he gets a prison term have increased exponentially. So he's going to have to deal with that as well. So whatever happens, though, the convention is going to make 2016 look like child's play. And Joy, as I think you said earlier, the hideous chance of lock her up, the utter lawlessness and vindictiveness that was directed at the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, was like nothing we had ever seen before in this country. It's going to be so much worse, so much darker, and especially given the fact that we've already seen what he's been doing. He and his minions and his enablers in the Republican Party have been telling us the last few months exactly what they plan to do with this country if we are reckless enough to give them power again.
Mary Trump, hi, it's Ari Melber. We try not to speculate too much, but you can. Do you have the view that Donald Trump, based on what you know, would be likely to fire his lawyer or lawyers in this case soon? We've seen some already depart, like Joe Tacopina, who used to be on the New York case. And if he gets legal counsel to show contrition, to authorize his lawyers to express that at sentencing, is there any way that you think he could play that out, pretend to feel that way for a day?
You know, Ari, I think he's constitutionally incapable of such a thing, even if it redounds to his benefit. And one of the biggest clues to that end is the way his lawyers behaved in the courtroom, clearly at his direction, even though it went against what they should have been doing to protect their client. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and even I was able to identify serious missteps his lawyers made because Donald was directing them to say certain things or behave in certain ways. And that's because he cannot face the truth about who he is or why he was there or what he's facing. So I don't think there will be any mitigating. There will certainly be no pretense, even pretense at contrition. And he's just going to put himself in even more jeopardy. Whether or not he retains his counsel, I don't know. If I were them, I wouldn't want to continue working for him. But I can't imagine they're having a very good night. Let's put it that way.
Mary Trump, we're really glad that you were able to be here with us tonight. It's a privilege to have you here on such an important moment in history. Thanks.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.